Hello and welcome to HTML Tips and Tricks. My name is Craig Campbell, and over the course of this series, I'm going to go over a few tips and tricks related to HTML, some of them specifically related to HTML5. And these tips and tricks that we're going to cover are everything from little easy, quick, superficial things that we can do with our HTML, just some short, fun little additions to HTML that can spice up our page, to some really useful, really powerful things that we can do with our HTML to make our information more useful, to make our sites more SEO friendly, and to enhance our social media efforts. Now let me point out that this is not an introductory course to HTML. Hopefully you already have a solid understanding of how HTML is put together, how HTML works. If not, then I would suggest an introductory level course first, and then jump into this tips and tricks course in order to learn some of the neat tools that we're going to go over throughout this series. So I hope you have a lot of fun working through this series. It's been a lot of fun putting it together, and I'll see you in the next video. Hello, and welcome back to HTML Tips and Tricks. In this lesson, we're going to lay the foundation for what we're going to be talking about for the next couple of lessons. And in this video in particular, I want to introduce the topic of semantic HTML. And some of this information might seem a little bit simplistic to some of you, but I need to make sure that we're all on the same page before we move forward. So what is semantic HTML exactly? Well, if you've been designing websites for over 10 or 15 years, then you're probably familiar with the B element for making your text bold, or the I element, the I tag, for making your text italic. You're probably also familiar with the old font tag, something we would never dream of using anymore. Well, these are all tags or elements that were designed to mark up the design of your document, to mark up what you want your content to look like. Semantic HTML, on the other hand, is markup that defines not what your document or what your information looks like, but what your information is. So we've graduated from using the B tag to make our text bold to using the strong tag, because just that word strong means we want to make this text, this particular piece of text, strong. And we can make decisions in our style sheets, in our CSS, as to what that strong text is going to look like. Is it going to be bold? Is it going to be larger? Is it going to be a different color? That decision is made on the style sheet side of things so that we can separate the design of our site from the content of our site. Similarly, we've graduated from using the italics tag here to using the emphasis tag, because again, the italics tag is defining a kind of a typeface. It's defining what we want our text to look like. Whereas the emphasis tag does just what it sounds like. It gives emphasis to a particular piece of text. And then in our style sheets, we would define what we want that emphasis to look like. And that's the idea behind semantic HTML. We want our markup to define what our content is, not what it's supposed to look like. So again, we're starting with this unsemantic version of HTML that you might have used 10, 15 years ago, where we're laying out everything using tables. Every table cell is basically a different section of content on our site. We have font tags everywhere. We have bold tags and italic tags everywhere. And if we go to Chrome and take a look at this particular page, this is what it looks like. Now, as far as the presentation of our document, we've achieved what we were going for. We have a header at the top. We have two columns of content, a sidebar and a main content area, and we have a footer at the bottom. So as far as our users are concerned, everything is just hunky-dory. However, as far as machines are concerned, when they try to parse through this content and read through this content, it's a little bit of a mess, because most of our content, most of our HTML markup is defining what we want this site to look like, not what this information contains. So as we move forward through history, we've upgraded a little bit. So we have this unsemantic HTML document, which you can find in your project files folder, and you're welcome to look through that and see a bunch of examples of what you're not supposed to be doing with your HTML. But I'm going to open up another document here in our project files folder called semi-semantic HTML.html. So we're going to open that up. And just for the purposes of these videos, I've put our styles in the head of our document. Normally, I would separate them into a separate file, but just for the sake of keeping our project files folder nice and clean, I've put it in the head of our document. So we have this semi-semantic HTML document, which if we scroll down, looks a little bit better. We're using the strong tag now instead of the bold tag. We're using the emphasis tag now instead of the italics tag. And we're using divs that kind of tell us what this content is supposed to be. This is our main content area. Up here, this is our sidebar, and we know that because we have a div with an ID of sidebar. We also have a div up top with an ID of header. And if we go back into our browser and look at the semi-semantic HTML document, we see that it's structured very similarly with a few text and color changes from the first document we looked at. So again, as far as the user is concerned, everything's fine. But this is not a truly semantic document. When we're talking about the semantic web, we're not talking about using markup that allows other designers and other developers to easily see what your content is. And that's kind of what we've done here. We've given our div an ID of sidebar. We've given another div an ID of main content so that we can more easily tell just by looking at our code what each section is, and then in our CSS we can point to those IDs in order to style them. Well, that's certainly a step in the right direction. We're no longer using tables for our layout. Instead, we're using divs with meaningful IDs. However, those IDs are only meaningful to your CSS file and to any developers or designers who might be looking at your code. These IDs or any classes that you use in your elements mean absolutely nothing when it comes to machines parsing through your HTML to see what kind of content you're using. And that's where HTML5 is taking a huge leap forward. We now have more semantic elements that allow us to mark up our code in a more semantic way. So if we open a third file here called semantic HTML.html, we have a better example. So instead of a div with an ID of header, since machines don't know what that ID means, we actually have a header element now. Instead of a div with an ID of main content, we now have this section element. And it may seem on the surface that divs and sections are basically interchangeable. We'll discover later on that when it comes to the structure of our document, the section element is much more powerful. And then instead of a div with an ID or a class of sidebar, we have the aside element. And then at the bottom, instead of a div with an ID of footer, we have a footer element. And again, because of all of the CSS we've added here, if we go into our code or into our browser and take a look at this semantic HTML document, it looks exactly the same as our last document, but it's structured more semantically in a way that makes more sense to the browser or to any machines that come through trying to interpret that data. And you might be thinking, well, if it looks okay, then what's the big deal? If my site looks nice and pretty in the browser, then why does it matter if it's structured properly? Well, if it looks nice, that's okay for your user will like that. But if the structure isn't there, if your content isn't marked up semantically, then web crawlers and search engines are going to have a problem parsing your code and deciding how to rank your content in search engines. So your content needs to be well structured and marked up in a semantic way so that not only people can read your code better, but so that machines can read your code. Now, marking up your content semantically does more than just make your content more visible or make it make more sense to search engines. It also makes your content more useful. For example, a really good example of a semantic element would be the address element. So if you put some text inside an address element, your browsers and anything that's crawling your information is going to assume that that's some kind of contact information. And if your iPhone browser, for example, sees that address element, then it's going to make it very easy for you to click on that address in order to take you to a map which tells you where that address is located. So by making your content more semantic, you're not only making it more accessible to search engines, but you're also making your content more useful. So again, just to emphasize the point, just because you're not using font tags and bold and italics tags anymore doesn't mean that your code is fully semantic. And understanding the way that search engines and other machines parse through your code and read its structure will go a long way in helping you to understand how to make your site more useful, not just more attractive. So we're going to use some of this information here as we move forward through the next couple of videos as we talk about how we can make our HTML just a little bit better. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Hello and welcome back to HTML tips and tricks. In our last video, we talked a lot about semantic HTML and how when we talk about semantic HTML, we're not talking about HTML that makes sense to a human. We don't care if a web designer comes in and is able to easily tell what all of our divs are for. Obviously, it is important for humans to be able to read it so that they can go in and edit it if it needs to be changed. But when we're talking about semantic HTML, we're talking about markup that we want screen readers and search engines and other machines to be able to parse correctly to determine the structure of our site. And we talked about how we want our markup to describe what our content is, not what it should look like. We also talked about how HTML5 has some new semantic elements that make this a little bit easier for us. And the elements I want to take a closer look at in this lesson are the sectioning elements. And there are 4 sectioning elements in HTML5. There's the nav element, where you would put any kind of navigation menus. We have the section element, the article element, and the aside element. But before we start using these elements, we really need to understand what they're there for and what they do. How is a section element, for example, different from a div? And even though it may seem like they're doing the same thing, behind the scenes, a section element is really much more powerful than a div. So in this video, I want to explore that just a little bit by talking about HTML outlines. And there's a great website out there that allows us to input some HTML, and then it basically parses through that HTML and spits out an outline of our page. And that's really helpful because it tells us how a machine is reading our code and how a machine is parsing the structure of our site. So I've prepared a very simple HTML file for this exercise called outlining.html, and you can find that in your project files folder. And all I really want to do here is to take that code, copy it, and then we're going to paste it into this website we're about to go to. So I'm going to jump over to Google Chrome. You can use whatever browser you want to. And the site we're going to is called HTML5 Outliner, and you can find it at gsnedders.html5.org/outliner. And I will include that URL in the course notes. And what this site does is it allows us to choose an HTML file that we have on our system, enter in a URL for an HTML file that's already stored online, or we could enter in some HTML of our own down here at the bottom. And that's what we're going to do because I want to play around with this and change it a little bit. So I'll come down here to the bottom section and get rid of everything that's there. And I'm just going to paste our code from our outline.html file. So this code is pretty simplistic, pretty straightforward. We just have a few different H tags here with some text in it. So we have a level 1 heading inside an H1 tag. We have an H2 element just below that, then an H3, and then another H2. And this will give us a good idea of how this outlining works. So instead of just clicking on outline this, I'm going to hold on to Command and click on it so that it will open this in a new tab. And we can see the results of that. So our level 1 heading is basically in the first level of our outline. The level 2 headings here and here are at the second indentation level of our outline. And then our level 3 heading has been indented even further. And that makes sense. There's no surprises there. So let's close that and let's go back into our code. And let's try to put some more structure around this. Let's say that we have our level 1 heading for our page. So we might have that inside a header element. So we'll go to the next line and we'll put a closing header element here, or closing header tag, excuse me. And then for our level 2 heading, let's go old school. Let's say that we have a div here with a class of main content. So let's say that we're going to have two columns of content in this site. We're going to have our main content column, which is going to be the wider of the two columns, and then we're going to have a sidebar column, which is obviously a lot smaller. So here's the opening div for our main content column. Then we'll have our level 2 heading here. We might also have a paragraph or two in here, so we'll just put a sample paragraph here, sample paragraph. And let me go ahead and point out that these paragraphs do not show up in the outliner. We're just going to see the headings in the outliner, but I'm putting these paragraphs here just to kind of help us illustrate the point. So we'll go to the next line after that paragraph, and we'll put our closing div tag there. So this is our main content div, which contains an H2 and a paragraph. Then on the next line, we'll put our opening tag for another div, and we're going to give that div a class of sidebar. And inside that sidebar, we're going to have our H3 tag, and I'm just going to get rid of this other H2 tag. So we're going to have an H3 tag. We'll go to the next line, and we'll put another sample paragraph here. Sample paragraph, close that. And then finally, after that, we'll put our closing div tag. So we have two separate divs, one of them with a class of main content, another one with a class of sidebar. And if we command click on outline this and take a look at our new tab, you'll see that our level 3 heading is still indented underneath our level 2 heading, which is basically indicating that this is a child of our level 2 heading. And that's really not what we're going for there. If we go back to our site, we don't want our sidebar to be considered a child of the main content column. The sidebar is probably going to have some content that's persistent across pages. It's not really going to be a child of the main content that's on this current page. So we don't want the outline to look like that. We don't want this level 3 heading that's in our sidebar to be a child of the level 2 heading that's in a completely separate column. And we can see that the use of divs here did nothing for us. And the HTML specification even says that divs don't really have any meaning within HTML other than the fact that we can style things using divs. So we can put a chunk of content inside a div tag and then style everything in that div separately. But when machines are crawling through our HTML, they're not going to see those div tags or those div elements as any kind of indication of the structure of the document itself. As we saw in the outline, it's putting our H3 tag here, which is in our sidebar. It's placing that as a child of the H2 tag, which is in a completely different column. And you might say, well, why don't we just make this an H2 tag as well? Well, that shouldn't matter. If we have two separate columns, it shouldn't matter what level we choose for our headings, whether one's an H1 and one's an H6. If they're in separate columns, one shouldn't necessarily be the child of the other. We want these columns to be treated separately so that machines can really understand the structure of our site. So how can we do that? Well, instead of using div tags, let's change this first one to a section tag. And we'll put our closing section tag here. And then the second one here is our sidebar. And we have a great tag for that called aside. So we'll put our opening and closing aside tags. Now when we outline our site, we're going to see something much different. If we click on this new tab, we can see that the level 2 heading and the level 3 heading are now at the same level just underneath the main level heading of our site or of our page. So now the level 2 heading and the level 3 heading are both being treated as basically sibling elements of the parent level 1 heading, which is the heading for the page as a whole, and that's kind of how we want to view it. So as we can see, these sectioning elements are much more powerful than a simple div tag. Because again, as far as structure goes, a div tag does nothing to enhance the structure of your site as far as search engines and screen readers and other machines are concerned. So if we use this semantic markup, our code will make sense not only to us, not only to other web designers, but also to screen readers and other machines as well. Well, what if we had things structured a little different? What if we had an article here instead of a section. And as far as headings go and outlines go, the article element will function very similarly to the section element. So if we outline this, we can see that it functions the same way as when we use the section element. So what if we had an article on our page and we had an aside that we were using in that article, but that aside, it wasn't necessarily a sidebar. Maybe it was a call out with some supplementary material, maybe just an extra description of some of the text in your article, but it's part of the article, but not really part of the main article. Instead, it's just some supplementary material about the article. Well, in that case, we would want this H3 to be a child of this H2 tag up here. And how could we make that happen? Well, we make that happen simply by nesting this aside element within our article. So we would just take our closing article tag here, cut it, and then come down here and paste it. So now our article takes up all of this space here, and our aside element is simply a part of that article. It's inside that article. When we do that and then outline our page, we can see that that level 3 heading is again made a child of that level 2 heading. So by the way that we nest our sectioning elements here, we can really determine how screen readers and search engines and other machines are going to recognize the structure of our document. And hopefully, armed with that knowledge of how these sectioning elements are used, you'll be able to create better, more structured HTML for your websites. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Hello, and welcome back to HTML Tips and Tricks. With all of this talk of semantic HTML, and with all of this talk about how sections and articles and asides and navs are better than divs, should we even worry about using divs anymore? Is there a time when it's okay to use a div? Well, before I answer that question, let me go ahead and point out that there's a lot of debate about this. Many people are sticking to their guns on using divs instead of sections, instead of asides, instead of headers and footers and things like that. And there's a lot of discussion out there from both sides of the spectrum. But I want to take a forward-looking approach and say that we do need to get used to adopting these new HTML5 sectioning elements, again, which are nav, section, aside, and article. However, there are still times when it's okay to use a div, but you need to keep in mind the structure of your site, and the elements that you're using need to support the structure of your site so that when search engines and other machines come in to parse through your code, they'll be able to easily determine the structure of your site, to determine what content is most important. So if you do decide to adopt the use of the section element and the aside element, which I highly suggest, then there is still a place for the div element. And there's a good example of that here on the semantic HTML.html page that you can find in your project files folder. This is a file that we've looked at before. Here you'll notice we've used the section element here. We could have used the article element instead if this was some kind of article. We have the aside element down here. We could also throw a nav element up top, but you'll notice that we also have a div here with a class of container. And this div is basically placed here so that we can put all of our content within a container that we can style. And if we jump over to Chrome to take a look at this page, we can see that our content is all contained within this area that is, if we look in our CSS, 800 pixels wide. And we used the div with the class of container to set that width and to set the margin to 0 auto so that we could center our content. So even when you commit yourself to using these semantic HTML5 elements, there is still a place for the div tag. And I would encourage you to use the div tag when you need another element there to help you get your styles in place, to get your page to look like what you need it to look like. You want to avoid using the div element to mark up the structure of your document, But when it comes to the design of your document, sometimes you need a div in order to get the styles that you're looking for. And again, this container element is a good example of that. Again, we have this container that contains all of our code, and that container doesn't really do anything for us from a semantic standpoint. But the important thing here is it doesn't take away anything from the structure of the site. It doesn't confuse browsers as to what the structure of our site is. We've taken care of the structure using these other more semantic elements, such as the section and aside elements, and we've only used the div here in order to provide styling where we couldn't do it using these other elements. So again, if you ask the question, should I use a div? Yes, there are definitely situations where you would want to use a div. I've never created a website, even recently, where I didn't use some kind of div in order to help out with the styling. So yes, divs are still important. They're still very useful. Just make sure that you're not relying on divs in order to mark up the structure of your document. So that wraps it up for this video. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Hello, and welcome back to HTML tips and tricks. We've talked a lot about using more semantic markup in our code, and we've talked about these great new semantic elements in HTML5, such as the article element, the section element, the nav element, and the aside element. But as is usually the case with web design, we always have to be on the lookout for Internet Explorer. Now in Internet Explorer 9, all of these elements work just fine. But older versions of Internet Explorer don't allow us to apply CSS code to an element that it doesn't recognize. And since it doesn't recognize the section element or the article element or the aside element, it won't let us apply CSS to those elements. So we couldn't set our aside up as a narrow sidebar on our page because older versions of Internet Explorer don't know what that aside element is and therefore won't let you apply CSS to it. However, I want to show you a very, very quick and easy way that we can make it work on those older browsers so we don't have to worry about Internet Explorer anymore. We just have to put a couple of lines of code in the head of our document in order to overcome that. So if we go to Google, I'm going to do a search for something called the HTML5 shim. And there's another version of it called the HTML5 shiv, and they're both basically the same thing. They achieve the same purpose. There's just two different items, one called HTML5 shim, one called shiv. The HTML5 shim is hosted at the Google Code repository. And if we search for HTML5 shim, one of the first search results you should see there is the one at code.google.com. So I'm going to click on that, and we can see that it's just a download. It's a JavaScript file that we place on our server, and then we simply link to it using this if statement that only Internet Explorer can recognize. So all other browsers are going to ignore this as simply a comment in your code, but Internet Explorer can recognize that, and it recognizes that we have an if statement here, and it says if less than, that's what the LT is for, if less than IE9. In other words, if we're using an older version of Internet Explorer, something older than IE9, then we want to attach this particular piece of JavaScript to our page. And that JavaScript makes it possible for us to add CSS to those elements that older versions of Internet Explorer may not recognize. In other words, that allows us to style our aside element and make it into a sidebar. So we can either do it this way, where we download the JavaScript file and then point to that JavaScript file on our own server, or we can point to the JavaScript file that's already hosted online. And to show you what that looks like, I'm just going to jump over to TextMate, and I've opened up a new file here called html5shim.html. And what this is doing, if you'll look in the head of that document, you'll see the code right here that's pointing to the actual code that's hosted on googlecode.com. And the great thing about using this instead of just hosting it on your own site is that many people have gone to websites that are pointing to this particular link. So A lot of people's browsers already have this particular JavaScript file in their cache, so it will load a lot more quickly. So I would advise you to open up this HTML5 shim.html file. And this is really just the semantic HTML file that we looked at before. I've just added this particular item into the head. And notice that I've placed this towards the top of the head of the document before our CSS. Technically, you can put it before or after the CSS. It should still work either way. I've just put it before because there's something in the back of my head that tells me it needs to be before, but either way it will work. So it doesn't really matter whether you put that, before or after your CSS. And when I say your CSS, usually you won't have your CSS in the head of your document, but you're going to have links to your CSS files. And again, you can put this particular comment here before or after those links to your CSS files. But again, this is just a simple JavaScript file that allows you to apply CSS code to these new elements such as aside and article and section and things like that in older versions of Internet Explorer that might not recognize them. So again, we always have to watch out for Internet Explorer as web designers. It's a pain, but it's there, it's real, we have to do it. So there you go. But I just wanted to show you how to get around that little bump in the road. So let me point out that anytime you're using these new HTML5 elements, make sure you include this HTML5 shim. If you don't, then you run the risk of your web page looking really bad in older versions of Internet Explorer. And there are still a lot of people that use IE7 and IE8. So again, make sure you always include this anytime you're using HTML5. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Hello, and welcome back to HTML tips and tricks. We've talked a lot about the importance of using semantic HTML in order to help search engines and other machines to accurately interpret the structure of our content. But as we've mentioned before, another benefit of semantic markup is that it can make our content more useful to the end user. If a browser, for example, is able to recognize a street address within our HTML, then that browser has the ability to do certain things with that information, such as maybe launching an application on your smartphone that shows that address on a map. And we've mentioned before that the address element in HTML5 allows us to mark up any addresses that we've placed in our content in order to make that information more useful to your end users. So imagine how useful it would be if we were able to mark up the title and author of your favorite books on your website. Or what if we were able to throw some markup around the name Led Zeppelin to let our browser know that we're talking about an artist? What if we were able to tell our browser that Ramble On is a song by that artist? Think of how useful that information could be if search engines crawling our site knew exactly what that information was. Well, what we're talking about here is something called microdata. And microdata is a mechanism that allows us to use machine-readable markup to deliver information about our content. To put it in simple terms, microdata is simply a way to give search engines more information about our content, to tell search engines that Led Zeppelin is a band and that Ramble On is a song that band sings. Well, there's a website, and I'm going to open it up here, called schema.org that provides an entire library of what they call shared vocabularies or schemas that we can use to add microdata to our HTML pages in a way that all of the major search engines can understand. And we don't have time in this series to go into great detail about what these schemas are and how to use these schemas. We could do a whole course on that, but I do want to introduce you to the topic and to show you where you can get more information about this. So if we come to the schema.org website and then click on the link for schemas up here in the upper right corner, we can see, if we look down towards the bottom of the page, a number of different examples, some commonly used examples that people will mark up in their content. So for example, we have creative works such as books, movies, musical recordings, TV series. We have events. Imagine how useful that could be if you were able to talk about an event. Maybe you're writing a blog post about a concert that you're going to go to, and you mark it up. You mark up the name of the event, the artist that's going to be playing there, what time it's going to be, where the location is. If you were able to give all of that location about the event and mark up that information in a way that search engines could recognize it, imagine how easy it would be to add more functionality to that particular piece of information so that the user could just click on that event on your page and suddenly your smartphone is popping up your calendar app and adding that event to your calendar. So again, using this microdata is a great way to make your content more semantic in nature because you're describing what your content is, not just what the content should look like. So again, there are tons of schemas on this website. These aren't the only ones that you have here. So if you can think of something that you'd like to describe in more detail in your HTML, you can just come to schema.org and do a search up here. And chances are, if it's a fairly common item, that there's already a schema that's been defined for that. So let's say that we have a website where we're talking about books. Maybe we're reviewing books that we've read. Notice that one of the schemas that's listed in schema.org is the book schema. And if we click on that, it will take us to more information about that. The first thing we see at the top of the page is kind of the hierarchical structure of this particular schema. This schema, this book schema, inherits from the creative work schema, which inherits from the more generic thing schema. And then as we look down the page, we can see different properties that are inherited from these three different schemas. So the properties that are inherited from thing would be more generic things like a description and an image and a name. So we would use the name for the title of the book and a description for maybe a short summary of the book. Then as we scroll down, we can see some properties that are available from the creative work schema, such as author. So here we would put the author of our book. If we scroll down further, we can see things like publisher, where we could not only put the publisher of the book in our website, but mark up that information to point out to search engines that this is the name of the publisher. We can also add reviews of the book and mark it up as such so that search engines recognize what that information is. And then if we go down to the book section, the properties that are specific to the book schema that it's not inheriting from these other two, we have things like book edition, book format, the ISBN number, which can be extremely useful, as you can imagine, for linking to Amazon and things like that. We even have the number of pages in the book. So these are all properties that are available to us, and we can mark up our content using any of these properties. So again, we can find where we have the title of the book in the text of our web page, and then we can just surround that by some markup using this name property from the book schema. And when a search engine comes by and sees that property applied to that piece of text, then the search engine will know that that piece of text is the title of a book. And we can do the same thing. We can search through our page for when we mention the author's name, and then we can use this author property to mark that up. Now let me show you what that would look like. We're going to scroll down further, and here we can see the original HTML. This is what it looks like before we add the markup to describe what this information is. So we have a bunch of information here. We have an image that has the cover of the book on it. We have the title of the book, The Catcher in the Rye, the publisher of the book, the author of the book. But when a search engine comes by, all it sees is a bunch of text. It has no idea that this is a book title, that this is a book author. It might recognize that those are popular terms that are often searched for, but it doesn't really know what this information is. So what we want to do is we want to mark it up to tell our search engines that this right here is the title of a book. Well, if we scroll down further, we can see what our content would look like once we marked it up with this schema.org markup. So at the top, we just have some information about the web page itself. We have some breadcrumbs, some navigation there. But once we get down to this area here, we start defining what this particular book is, the title, the author, and things like that. And it's all contained within a div that has an item type, and that item type is the URL of this particular schema where the book schema is defined. And this div lasts from here all the way down towards the end of our content here. And we'll just keep scrolling down to this closing div tag here. So everything within this div pertains to that particular book. So even if you're just mentioning the book name and the book author in a paragraph, you can still use this markup. So you would just put this div before that paragraph, and then inside the paragraph you might have a span with an item prop of name, and inside that span you would have the title of the book. And again, this item prop is the property that we found up here towards the top. Here's the name of the book. So that's the item prop that we're applying to it. And we can see under the second column, it's expected to be just a piece of text here. Some of these item properties are a little bit more complicated. Instead of just being some text, some of these item properties are actually another schema in and of themselves. So we can see the property name for this one is aggregate rating with a lowercase a, but it points to a schema with aggregate rating with a capital A there. And so that's the rating of a book based on a collection of reviews. So let's go back down to our markup here. And so we can see again, all of this is contained within a div with an item scope attribute, which isn't set equal to anything, but that attribute needs to be there. And then we have item type set to the URL of that particular schema, which is book. And then inside that div, we have all of this information. So we couldn't just put item prop of name in the middle of our paragraph without defining what schema we're talking about. So we need this first line up here in order to tell us what this is a name for. This is a name of a book. And then down here we have the author, J.D. Salinger. So this one is inside an anchor tag, and that anchor tag is given an item prop of author. And by doing that, we're able to point out that this is the author of a book, so that when a search engine comes to our page, it knows exactly what this content is, and it can do certain things with that content. And notice that it gets really specific. We have things like reviews and prices that we can mark up. We can mark up the actual price of the book. We can mark up the publisher and things like that. And you'll notice that we mentioned the aggregate rating before. We have an item prop here of aggregate rating, but you'll notice it's pointing to a new item type. So this is a new schema that it's pointing to of aggregate rating. And then inside that schema, we're defining two separate item props, the rating value and the review count, the number of reviews that have been submitted. So I would really encourage you to at least take a look at schema.org. There are a lot of different schemas here that can be really useful in marking up your content and making that content more useful to your end users. And let me just show you one way that it can be useful. If we open up a new tab here, go to google.com, and let's say we want a recipe for chicken spaghetti. And you'll see here that towards the top of our page, we have a number of really helpful looking search results that have an image, they have a rating, the number of reviews, how long it takes to make that recipe. All of this is done using this type of microdata. So if we go to this chicken spaghetti recipe and then right click and click on view page source, and then I'm going to do a quick search, Command F to find text, and we're going to find the text schema. And sure enough, we can see an item type that's pointing to schema.org/recipe. So because we've labeled or marked up this content as a recipe, we're getting these really fancy search results. I didn't mean to close that last one. Let's open that tab again and go back one page. We're getting these really fancy search results that really help our page to stand out. And all of that happens because we used this microdata that's available to us at schema.org. So again, I really want to encourage you to take a look at schema.org. That's one way to really wow your clients if you're able to get them search results that look like this. So again, a very, very useful way to give more information about what your content is in your website. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Hello, and welcome back to HTML tips and tricks. In this lesson, we're going to finally move on from all of this talk about semantic HTML, semantic markup, and we're going to start talking about some other tips and tricks that can be helpful to you as a web designer or developer. And one of the things I want to talk about are the best practices for placing comments inside your HTML code. Now, some people use comments like crazy. They use it to mark up everything in their code. But I guess before we jump into this, let me talk about what a comment looks like. It starts off with the less than sign, an exclamation point, and 2 dashes. And then we have our comment, and then we have 2 more dashes and a greater than sign. So everything contained between this and this is considered a comment and is basically ignored by the browser. But again, as I mentioned, some people put comments all over the place. Some people will just put a lot of dashes there, and then they might put their comment here. This is the main container, and then a bunch more dashes, and then the end of the comment. And then they'll put something like this in front of every section of their website. And while that really does help, if you're standing back looking at this website, it helps you to be able to find that section of your site very easily because it really stands out. It also clutters your site with a lot of extra bandwidth. And if you have a high traffic site, having a lot of comments like this can really be a bump on your bandwidth. So you want to avoid using comments except where they're really needed. So I'm going to get rid of this comment, and we're going to talk about a couple of common uses for comments in HTML, places where it might make sense to use comments. One good reason for using comments is if you have a bunch of divs or other elements that are nested within each other and you need to be clear which div you're closing whenever you put a closing div tag, for example. And if you're using an HTML framework such as Bootstrap, you might have a bunch of div classes defining the columns for all of your content. So Bootstrap uses, for example, classes like callMD4 to define the width of a particular column within your code. So if we have a bunch of these divs that have that class assigned to it, and we put those inside a div with a class of rows so that we can style it better, and then all of that is inside a div with an ID of container. We have all of these divs nested inside each other. Sometimes it can get kind of confusing as to which div you're closing whenever you put a closing div tag. Here we have 2 closing div tags in a row, and this one right here is closing something that started way up here. And as you can imagine, if you have a full-sized web page here, some of the opening and closing tags might be really far apart. So it would make sense to put comments here in order to indicate which div you're closing whenever you close a div. So here we have a particular column. So we could put one here that says end of call MD4 and then the end of our comment there. And that would make sense. We're basically saying that this closing div tag here is closing a div with a class of callMD4. And since all 3 of these columns here have that class, we could just copy this comment here and paste it here and here. Now, if that column is just a little bit of information like what we have here, if it's just one line of information and then the closing tag, it might be a little superfluous to put that comment there because it's really clear that this div tag or this closing div tag is closing this div element that starts up here. It's very clear where the beginning and end of that div are. However, once you have some opening and closing tags that are spaced further apart, it would make sense to use comments like this to close them. So for this one down here, it's spaced out a little bit more from its opening div tag. So it would make sense here to put a comment that says end of row. And then we can get rid of all of these extra because the more of these you put on your page, the more bandwidth your site is going to take up. So you want to keep these to a minimum and really just use them when you feel like they're needed, when you feel like they're going to help you maintain your site better. Because remember, after you create your site, somebody still has to maintain it. And if you include comments like this every now and then that can really help to parse through your code visually without having to draw an outline of every div that's on the page. So then we come down here to our closing div here, and that one's really far from its opening div tag. So we might put a comment here that says end of container. Now, ideally, you won't wait until you're done coding the page to do that. But let's say that we were creating our container div when we first started creating our website. So we would put our opening div tag here with an ID of container. Let's just pretend like all of this content up here isn't there right now. So we type in div ID of container, skip a couple lines, and I always put my closing div before I put all of the content inside it. That way I never forget to close the div. So we create our opening and then our closing div, and then we put the information inside it. That's just the way that I do things because it really helps me to never forget to put a closing div tag. So then after our closing tag, we'll put our comment immediately that says end of container. That way, I don't have to wait till I'm finished with the entire document to try to sort through all my closing divs in order to figure out what that closing div is actually closing. So again, it helps me to always create my closing div immediately after I create my opening div. And if I know that that div is going to have a lot of information in it, then I'll go ahead and put a comment there in order to keep things from getting too confusing. So let's get rid of that. Let's assume that we created all of our comments before we added all of this information inside our content. And then let's talk about another common use for comments. Let's say that you're having problems with the layout of your page. Something's broken and you can't figure out what it is. Well, sometimes it makes sense to come in and comment out certain parts of your page to see if that particular piece of the page is the culprit, to see if that's what's breaking our code. Or maybe that particular piece of code isn't breaking anything, you just want to get it out of the way temporarily in order to fix other problems on the page. Maybe you want to get everything else looking right before that particular piece of code, before that particular piece of content shows up. So then we could come into, let's say we wanted this article. Let's say we just wanted to get it out of the way before we worked on other parts of the page. So we would just put our opening comment tag here, and we need to get rid of this greater than sign that TextMate automatically puts there for us. And another way we can do this, let's just get rid of that and go to the next line, and we'll just put this opening comment tag before that first line. And then after the article, we'll put our closing comment tag. So everything in between our opening and closing comment tag, even if it's on multiple lines, is going to be commented out. So then we can comment out that entire article and then finish styling the rest of our page before we uncomment that article and start styling it. So temporary comments like this are often used to either debug code to see if a particular portion of code is what's causing something to break, or to temporarily get rid of a piece of code without actually deleting it so that we can work on other pieces of our web page without that particular piece of code getting in the way. So those are two common uses of comments in HTML, and I just want to encourage you once again to avoid overdoing it with your comments. It's very important to use comments. It can really make the maintenance of your site a lot easier, but definitely try to avoid overdoing it because you don't want to add a bunch of unnecessary bandwidth when you don't need to. So thank you for watching. I'm going to go ahead and save this file as comments2.html just so you'll have that final file in case you wanted to look over the changes I made. And I'll see you in the next video. Hello and welcome back to HTML tips and tricks. In this lesson, I want to talk about a few different meta tags that are often used in HTML. So we're going to start by creating our document. So we'll put our doc type here first, and we're using HTML5. So we'll just say doc type HTML. We'll put our opening HTML tag, set language equal to EN for English, skip a couple lines, and put our closing HTML tag. Then we'll put our opening and closing head tag and our opening and closing body tags. If we can spell that right. Okay. So since we're dealing with meta tags here, we're going to be doing all of this within the head of our document. And the first thing I want to do just inside the head is to enter in the character set that we're going to be using. So we would use the meta tag here, space character set or char set, CHARSET, equals, and we're going to set that equal to UTF-8. Now this is a much simpler character set tag than we used to have in older versions of HTML. And since this one is so much easier to remember, there's no excuse for you not to use it. Because if you don't use it, then there is a potential for attacks on your site by making your browser or making the server think that this is encoded with UTF-7, and then they can inject some nasty UTF-7 code in there to hack into your website. So make sure you use this particular character set meta tag. The next thing we always want to include, and this isn't technically a meta tag, but it's the title tag, and it's very, very important to your site. So you have up to 70 characters that you want to use here to really describe your site. And if you're targeting certain keywords on your site, you would want to try to use the main keyword you're targeting here. So let's just say 70 characters maximum. And again, you want a meaningful title here that really talks about what's on your page, but also targets a specific keyword for your page. Another meta tag that you want to make sure to use is the description tag. So meta name equals description, content equals, and then you'll enter your description here. So let's talk about the description tag. Now, let me go and finish typing this out because I apparently cannot talk and type at the same time. So the description tag doesn't necessarily have an impact on your search engine results, at least not a direct impact. There are some people that would argue that it does have a small impact, but if there is an impact, it's very, very minimal. So the description meta tag is almost completely useless when it comes to trying to target certain keywords to get certain search results. However, having said that, it's very, very important because the content that you put here is going to show up on your search result. So I'm going to jump over to Google real quick and we're going to do a search for Dallas Stars hockey. So if we scroll down a little bit past the ads and past the initial fancy search results, we'll come down to the regular search results, and your meta description is what's going to show up right here. Now, if you don't include a meta description, then it's just going to somewhat randomly select some text from your web page, and you don't know what that text is going to be. It might be the most boring paragraph on your entire page. Hopefully you don't have any boring paragraphs on your page. If you do, you need to get rid of them. But you still want to be able to control what shows up here on your search result, because some studies show that almost half of the people that go to Google and search for something will click on the link based on this description that shows up down here. So that description is very, very powerful in helping you to get clicks whenever your search results show up. So even though that description doesn't have a direct result on where your search results show up on the search results page, it does have an effect on whether or not people click if your page does show up. So you want some strong text here that really gets people's attention to let them know whether or not this is the site they want to click on. So again, this description tag is very, very helpful. And before we go any further, I'm going to go ahead and change the encoding here to HTML so that it will actually color code it for us, and that looks a lot better. Okay, so we want the character set, we want a title, we want a description. One more item I want to put here, which isn't technically a meta tag, it's a link tag, but we're going to set rel equal to author. And this is another tag to include in your head that will help out with your search results. It will also help with the way your search results look if you do it right. So we're setting relationship equal to author, basically saying that I'm the author of the content on this page. And then we're going to set href equal to the URL of our Google Plus profile. So if you don't have a Google Plus profile, first of all, I want to highly suggest that you set one up. Then once you set it up, go to your main profile page, copy the link to that page and then paste it here. So it would look something like this: https://plus.google.com/, and then there would be some other stuff after that. So I'm just going to put link to Google Plus profile. And if you set this up right, then your search results are going to look really fancy when people come to your site on Google. So let's go back to Google and see an example of what that would look like. So let's say we wanted to look for Dallas Stars blog. And down here we see it's going to look something like this. This isn't exactly it. I don't see any. Let's actually do some more searches. Let's say that we're searching for jQuery tips. And we scroll down a little bit, and here we go. We see a link here for a search result that has a little image next to it. And that image is going to be the Google profile picture of this particular person. And by including that link tag there, if you set it up right, it will allow you to enhance what your search results look like by adding that Google Plus profile picture to your search results. So again, once you set up your Google Plus profile, make sure that you also upload a picture for that profile so that it can be used in that search result. So those are just a few items to include in the head of your document that sometimes we might get a little lazy about, but these all can be very, very powerful tools to include in the head of your HTML. So I'm going to go ahead and save this file so you'll have access to it, and we'll just call it meta.html. And again, they're not all technically meta tags, but these are just a few items you would include in the head of your HTML document that could really help you out. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Hello, and welcome back to HTML tips and tricks. After our last video about meta tags, you might be wondering, where are my keywords? In the old days of web design, we had another meta tag that was almost crucial in helping to get us good search results, and that was the keywords meta tag. And it would look something like this: meta name equals keywords, and then content equals, and then we'd have a list of keywords. So I don't know, keyword 1, comma, keyword 2, etc. So you'd have a list of keywords to help search engines identify the content that's on your page. However, Google and other search engines no longer even pay attention to this meta tag with a name of keywords. This is completely useless now for trying to get search results. In fact, one source I read said that the only major search engine that uses keywords is Bing, and the only thing Bing uses them for is to filter out spammers, websites who are spamming with tons of keywords. So really all keywords can do, if that's true, is hurt your search results. So that's why we no longer use the keywords meta tag in the head of our document. So it's just a little quick tip to keep in mind. We're no longer using the keywords meta tag. That's an ancient fossil. We're no longer referring to that anymore. So if they're in your page, get rid of them. They're not going to do you any good anyways. They're just going to take up bandwidth. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Hello, and welcome back to HTML tips and tricks. In this lesson, we're going to talk about the problem of duplicate content and how you can fix that in your HTML. Now, first we need to define what the problem is. There are a lot of people that think if you have multiple versions of the same piece of content on your site, that you will be somehow penalized by Google or by other search engines for that. And that's not necessarily true. You can get penalized for duplicate content if it's not your own content. So if you're just republishing somebody else's article on your own site without adding anything to it, without adding any value or commentary of your own, then you can be penalized for that type of duplicate content. But if you just simply have multiple URLs on your site pointing to the same content that is your own content, you won't be penalized by Google for that, but there are some problems that can crop up. And the problem that usually crops up when you're dealing with having multiple URLs that point to the same content is which one of those URLs is your preferred URL. When Google, for example, sees multiple pages on your site that have the exact same content, Google by default groups all of those pages together and chooses what it thinks is the best link to that content. And most of the time, Google may be right about which is your preferred link. However, if you want to take full control of your search engine optimization efforts, then you want to go into your page and specify what your preferred link is. And that preferred URL is called the canonical URL. So why would you even have duplicate content on your page? Well, let's say that you had a page with a bunch of news articles on it, and those news articles are grouped into different categories, and those categories are part of the URL that you type in to get to that particular article. So you might have website.com/category name/name of the article. Well, if you have one article that is in two separate categories, then you might have two different URLs you can use to get to that article, and Google would recognize that. They would see both of those links and basically try to decide for themselves which one of those links is the preferred URL or the canonical URL. Well, you can specify in the head of your HTML document what the preferred URL is for a particular piece of content. Also, you can see this problem quite a bit in WordPress. WordPress often makes multiple URLs that point to the same content. So it's important to be able to specify which one of those URLs is your preferred URL for when people are searching for information in Google. When somebody searches for information that points to your site, which one of those multiple URLs do you want them to click through to? So as you can imagine, it can be very powerful to be able to tell Google which one of these pages is your preferred or canonical URL. And it's very easy to do. All it involves is adding a link tag to the head of your document. And it looks like this. So let's say that we have this page here, and this page has a bit of content on it, and we're using this exact same content on this page on a different page of our site. And we want to specify which one of those two pages is our canonical URL, or the URL that we prefer for this particular set of content. So what we can do is go into the head and create a link tag here, and we're going to set the relationship or rel attribute equal to canonical, and then we'll simply set the href equal to the preferred URL. So we would point to http://www.website.com/category/preferred URL.html. And it's as simple as that. You would simply just point to the URL that you would prefer users to come to from Google when they're looking for this particular piece of content. And it's important to point out that this link can be a relative link too. So you could point to something like /category/preferred URL.html. So that can be an absolute or a relative link. But this is a very easy, very quick way that you can specify to Google which URL you would prefer users to come to in the event that you have duplicate content on your site. So now that I've added our link to this page, I'm just going to save it. And this page is called duplicatecontent.html, and you can find that in your project files folder. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Hello, and welcome back to HTML tips and tricks. In this lesson, we're going to talk about a few meta tags that can really help us out in our social media efforts. And I'm going to jump over to a browser here to illustrate what I'm talking about. If we go to our favorite sports blog, for example, let's go to defendingbigd.com, which is a blog about the Dallas Stars. So let's say we click on one of these articles here. We read the article, we really like it. We scroll down to the bottom and we see a link for Facebook to share this on Facebook. Or even if you don't see a link, you could always just copy this URL, go to Facebook, and then in your status, paste this URL. And when you do that, you'll get something that looks like this. I'm going to go ahead and click on this Facebook share button. You'll get something that looks like this. So you can write something about this article, and you'll get, what I want to focus on here is this section down here where we have an image, a title, a URL, and a description. What I want to do in this lesson is to talk about a few meta tags we can add in the head of our HTML document that will allow us to customize the way that this item looks whenever somebody tries to share a link to your page. Now, if you don't include any of this meta information, then Facebook will make its best guess as to what information should go here, as well as what picture should show up here. And since you really want to make a good first impression, you don't want Facebook just randomly selecting one of the images from your page in order to place in this preview. Even though Facebook gives your users an option of clicking through these left and right arrows to choose an image that they want to post with this, it's better if you can control that image yourself, because then you can really control the way your image is portrayed when it shows up on somebody's Facebook page. So in this lesson, we're going to talk about how we can do that. And the great thing about what we're going to do is it will work on other social media sites as well, such as Google+. So I'm going to click on cancel here. I don't want to actually post that. And I'm going to jump over to our text editor. And I've just opened up the duplicate content HTML file from the last video. So we'll just make some changes to it by adding a few meta tags here. So I'm going to change the title here to meta tags for social media. And then in the head of our document, we'll skip a couple lines after the link tag there, and we'll get started talking about how to add these meta tags. Well, these meta tags are based on the Open Graph protocol that is available in Facebook, which allows you to, again, optimize the way that these results show up by specifying certain pieces of metadata. So the first thing I want to talk about is the title tag here. And this, again, this is a meta tag. So we're going to use the meta tag, but we're going to give it a property, set that property equal to OG for Open Graph, title. So inside this tag, we would put the title that we want to show up on those Facebook posts. So the way we do that is we set content equal to, and then inside quotation marks, we would put the title. So this is the title of my article. This may end up being the same as the title tag for your page, or you might want to make it catchier for Facebook. So you could put whatever title you want to here, and that would be your first meta tag. Then we go to the next line, and let's say we want to specify the type of content that we're linking to here. So the way we do that is we type OG type. And there are a number of different types that we have access to, such as blog, website, or article. Usually it's going to be something like blog or article. So let's just type blog here. And that takes care of that one. Then let's say we wanted to specify the thumbnail image that shows up on the left side so that we don't allow the Facebook user to select which image from the website they want to stick there. We want to really control the way our message is presented on Facebook. So what I would suggest doing is creating your own square-shaped image. Make sure it's not rectangular. Make sure it's a square image, and just upload that to your server and put a link to it here in this particular meta tag, which has a property which you might be able to guess. It's OG image. So here we would set content equal to the URL of the image. So http://www.website.org/image.jpg, or wherever your image is located. And that image would serve as the thumbnail that shows up whenever somebody tries to link to your page on Facebook or Google or wherever. Then we might want to specify the actual URL that it links to. For example, we've talked before about duplicate content and about how some content can have multiple different URLs that point to that same piece of content. So what we want to do here is kind of like our canonical link up here. We want to specify what URL is going to be displayed here. So we're going to set this property equal to OG:URL. And again, we would just set the content equal to whatever that URL is. Then we might want a description. In fact, we definitely want a description. Otherwise, it's probably just going to try to pull some text from your page. And again, just like with everything else, the way we do that is we create a meta tag with a property, you got to spell that right, This time the property is OG colon, you guessed it, description. And then we would set our content equal to the description that we want to show up in that little Facebook blurb. So this is my awesome link-worthy description. Now you can make this description relatively long, not too long. It has to be 297 characters or less. So make sure you don't go over 297, but that should give you enough room to write out a description that really catches people's attention and makes them want to click through to your website. So again, using these open graph meta tags is a fantastic way to customize the way that your website's little blurb shows up whenever somebody tries to link to your page on Facebook or other social media sites such as Google+. So thank you for watching. I'm going to save this as, let's call it socialmeta.html. We'll save that and move on to the next video. Thank you for watching. Hello and welcome back to HTML tips and tricks. In this lesson, I want to show you one of my favorite little HTML5 goodies, and that's the idea of editable content. In HTML5, you can allow your users that come to your page to edit any of the content that's on your page simply by applying one little attribute to that particular element. So I've got opened up editable content start.html, which you can find in your project files folder. And we're going to make some changes to this and then we'll save it with a different name later. But here we have right now in the body just an H1 tag. Well, I'm going to go down to the next line and I'm going to create a paragraph tag. And we'll say you cannot edit this paragraph. Closing paragraph tag. And then on the next line, we'll create a second paragraph that says, but you can edit this one. And put our closing paragraph tag. And the way we make this editable is very easy. We simply go inside the opening paragraph tag here and type in content editable equals true. That's all you have to do. So let's go ahead and save this with a new name. I'm going to call it just editable content. We'll get rid of the hyphen start there. So we'll save that. And then I want to open it up in Chrome. So I'm going to jump over to Google Chrome. Command O to open a file on your computer, and then in your project files folder you'll find editable content.html that we just saved. Click on open and it will open that page. So here we see editable content. We can click on that. We can't do anything. You cannot edit this paragraph. We can click around, can't edit it, but if we click in this paragraph you'll see it highlights it, and we can come in here and say, hey, I just changed a paragraph. And then if we hit enter, we can go to the next line and type in all that we want to and then click outside. And now it's part of the web page. And if you combine this with something like HTML5's local storage capability, and technically it's not really an HTML5 capability, but if you combine this with something like local storage, then you can actually have this information stay on the page even if they close the browser and come back. Now we're not going to talk about local storage here because that's more of a JavaScript conversation and we're just doing HTML tips and tricks, but it's really cool that you can go in and just change the text on a web page. And keep in mind that that applies to any child elements of the item that you're trying to edit. So if we were to go back to our page and add an unordered list, for example, let's just create an unordered list with that same content editable equals true. And then we'll skip a couple lines, put our closing unordered list tag, and here we'll create a few list items. So this is item 1, and then I'll just copy that list item, and then just paste it a few times. That'll work. Well, maybe one more time. And then we'll change the numbers here, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Save that, go back to Chrome, refresh your page. Now we can still edit this paragraph, but we can also come into any of these items here and edit them. So if we go to item 6 here and say, I just changed a list item. And you'll notice when you hit enter, it actually creates a new list item for you. So if you wanted to create some kind of to-do list as a web page, you can do that using again, a combination of this idea of editable content and local storage. But I mean, you can make as many list items as you want here. So again, it's not entirely useful without combining it with something like local storage, but it's a neat little tip, and I wanted to point that out in case you weren't already aware of it. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Hello, and welcome back to HTML tips and tricks. In this lesson, I want to talk about another very quick tip in HTML5 for enhancing your inputs for email addresses. And we're going to start with this file called email_inputs_start.html. And here we have just a simple form with an email address and a submit button. And if we jump over to Chrome and open up that file, email_inputs_start.html, we can see an input where we can type in our email address and then a submit button. We click on it and it will process whatever form we want it to process. Well, what I want to do is I want to make this text field here, this input field, a little bit smarter. And we now have the ability to change this type from text to email. And when we do that, I'm going to save this with a new name. We'll just call it email_inputs.html. Well, if we jump over to Chrome and let's open up that page, email_inputs.html, everything still looks exactly the same. Notice we've still got a text field here, but now if we just enter in some dummy text here and then click submit, we actually get a little validation error that pops up that says, please enter an email address. So our browser recognizes that this is not an email address that we entered into this email field, and it gives us an error. Now keep in mind that this is still a very new concept. So not all browsers can handle this. Not all browsers will treat it in the same way, but it's really cool that we have the ability to do this. It's just a little bit of extra added functionality that looks really cool, and you're able to do it very, very quickly and very easily. Just keep in mind that even though it seems we're doing some sort of validation here, that because browsers are kind of different in the way that they handle these kind of things, you still need to provide some kind of server-side or client-side validation for your email addresses. Don't rely on this as your only source of email address validation. But again, that's a really cool new feature that we're able to apply with just a small change in our HTML. And another really cool thing about giving this an input type of email instead of text is that if you were to go to this page on a cell phone, such as an iPhone, I'm not sure what all phones do this, what all smartphones do this, but I know the iPhone does. If you go to this page on an iPhone and click inside, or I guess tap inside this email field and start typing in your email address, you'll get a special keyboard that pops up that actually makes it easier to type in your email address because it includes the little @ symbol, and it gives you a different keyboard that makes it easier, again, to type in an email address, which is a very, very user-friendly thing to do for your iPhone users. So again, just a very quick little tip on how to enhance your email address text fields. And with that done, we'll move on to the next video. Thank you for watching. Hello, and welcome back to HTML tips and tricks. In this lesson, we're going to talk about another really neat HTML5 trick for working with forms. In our last video, we talked about email inputs, where we can change our type to email in order to provide a nice little bit of validation. Again, not the type of validation that we can really rely on yet. So you want to include other server or client-side validation, but it's a really neat feature that the newer browsers work with really well. Well, in this lesson, I want to talk about another similar feature dealing with forms in HTML5, and that's the idea of making required fields. So let's say we had a few inputs here. So let's go before the email address and say we had another label, and let's just copy this line here. It'll make it a little easier. We'll just copy that entire label and input field, and then we'll paste it up here, and we'll create an F name for first name. We'll type in first name here, and then we need to give this a name of F name and an ID of fname, and our type is text. This is not an email input. This is just a plain text input. So then let's copy that, go to the next line and do the same thing for last name. So this is the label for the lname text field, which we haven't created yet, but we'll type that out. So then we need to change this to lname, change this to lname, and type to text. Then, just for kicks, let's ask for the user's social security number. So let's say that we're a very, very shady website and we're asking for people's social security number here. Maybe they'll give it to us, maybe they won't, but we're going to make this an optional text field. We won't make them enter that in, but you get the idea. So we'll give the same name and ID to it, a type, if we can spell that right, there we go, type of text. And let's say that we want to make the first and last names required, but obviously we want to leave the social security number maybe optional. So the way we do this is very easy, and we can do it one of two ways. We can either just type required here, or we can type required equals required. Either way it should work. And again, this is a relatively new feature, so it will only work on the latest of browsers. But I'm just going to type in the word required here, and we're going to do it for last name as well. And then let's also add that to the email address. So we'll let them choose whether they want to give us their social, and we'll just require everything else. So let's save this file. Actually, first, before we do that, let's change the title here to required inputs. Then I'm going to save this file as required inputs.html. Then we'll jump into our browser and I'm going to open up required inputs.html. So we open that up and we see a few different text fields here. And let's actually just make this a little bit better by putting some line breaks here. Just copy that, paste, paste, and paste. Save that, refresh our page. There we go. It's a little easier to work with. So let's just say that we entered in our first name, Fred, and then just click on submit. Now you'll see that we have a validation that pops up that says, please fill out this field. And we were able to get that validation without any kind of JavaScript, without any kind of server-side code or anything. Again, as I've mentioned numerous times before, this is not necessarily the type of validation you want to completely rely on just yet. It's just a nice new feature. So in addition to doing this, you also want to provide the same type of server or client-side validation that you would usually use. So it tells us it needs our last name. So let's say our last name is Jones, Fred Jones. We'll click on submit. And you'll see that it didn't tell us that we needed to fill out the social security number field, but it did say we need to fill out the email address field. So we could fill that out with some random information. And when we click submit, we didn't enter a valid email address. Please enter an email address. So then we could say @fred.com, click on submit, and then everything works fine. Now, obviously this form isn't tied to anything, so it's not actually processing any information, but it's really cool that we're now able to create required fields that have that kind of immediate interaction just using HTML. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Hello, and welcome back to HTML tips and tricks. In this lesson, I want to talk about one more thing that we can do with our forms, and it's another type of validation based on regular expressions. Now, if you've never used regular expressions, don't worry about it. It's kind of complicated. If you just try to read it and you've never seen it before, it will make absolutely no sense to you, but it's a way to match a pattern. For example, we talked about our email address text field here. When we talk about matching a pattern, we're trying to make sure that what we type in here matches the pattern of an email address, which usually looks like something at something else dot something. And obviously there are a few more patterns than just that for an email address, but you get the basic idea. If we click on submit here, what's really happening, and let's go ahead and fill out these other fields just so that it will be happy with us. If we click on submit, it says, please enter an email address. So what's happening in the background here is it's evaluating what we entered in here based on or against a set pattern for email addresses. And it's recognizing that this doesn't match that pattern, so it's giving us a validation error. Well, using HTML5, there are other types of validations we can do using regular expressions. The problem is we have to know something about regular expressions, or we have to know where to find the regular expression that we would want to use. So let's jump into our text editor of choice, and let's add a pattern validator to one of these inputs here. Let's say that we want to leave our social security number field optional, but if they do enter it in, we want to make sure they enter it in the right format. Well, the way we do that is we go into the particular input field that we want to apply a pattern validation to, and we're simply going to create another attribute here called pattern, and we're going to set that equal to a regular expression. And we need to put that inside quotation marks here. So inside quotation marks, I'm just going to paste Command V, the regular expression for social security numbers. And I'll show you in a minute where you can find a bunch of different patterns using regular expressions. But for now, we're just going to paste that in there, save our file as pattern validation.html, and we'll go ahead and change the title to pattern validation. Save that. Go back to our browser and we'll open that file up. So we're looking for pattern validation.html. So we'll enter in a first and last name here. We'll go ahead and enter in a valid email address here. So at red.com, sure, that works. And for social security number, I'm just going to enter in some letters here and click on submit. And we see it says, please match the requested format. And that's cool. It recognizes that we didn't use the right pattern and it gave us a pop-up. Again, if we click on submit, it says, please match the requested format. Well, we can do something more to make this message more meaningful. Come back over here, and I'm going to add a title attribute that says, please enter a valid social, I'll just type SSN for now so I don't have to type all of that out. Please enter a valid SSN. So we'll save that, go back to our page and refresh it, and then we'll enter in some stuff again. And then this at that.com, click on submit, and you'll notice we have an extra message down here. Please enter a valid SSN. So if we come in here and enter 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and click on submit, you'll see that it works. We could also, let's come back in here and do this again. This at that.com, and we could enter 1, 2, 3/45/6/789 and click on submit, and that works too. So that particular regular expression accepts a social security number with just 9 numbers or with the dashes in between. So now that we've shown you that, let's jump into a website called html5pattern.com. This is a great website for finding almost every regular expression that you'll probably use in your HTML forms. So we have things like names. So if we click on names, we see that we can do a number of different types of names. Either we can just do an alphanumeric name, a username with 2 to 20 characters, a Twitter username, which only has a maximum of 15 characters, or a Facebook username. There's also a backwards compatible Twitter username, because Twitter usernames used to be allowed 32 characters instead of just 15. So we could throw in something for a username with 2 to 20 characters. So let's say that we just want an alphanumeric name with no more than 20 characters, but at least 2 characters in it. So we'll highlight this one. Oops. Highlight that. Command C or Control C if you're using a PC to copy it. Then we'll jump back into our text editor. And for our first name, we will add an attribute that says pattern equals, and then inside quotation marks, we'll paste that regular expression we just copied. So we'll save that, come back to our file here, refresh it. And then for our first name, let's just put a lot of characters in here, way more than the accepted amount. And then last name, social security number, 111111111, email address, this at that.com. Okay, so we'll click on submit, and you'll see that it says please match the requested format. So if we get rid of some of these letters here, we just have a few letters, click on submit, and everything works fine. So again, this HTML5 pattern website is a great place to go to find most of the regular expressions, that you would ever need for your HTML forms. So you'll see things like postal codes for America and Australia and Belgium, etc. You'll see dates, phone numbers, emails, etc. Now, if we go to emails, you'll actually see what we've already talked about. You just enter type equals email instead of using a regular expression, because as this mentions, every regular expression for email validation is missing something. So there are too many different types of email addresses out there to really be able to effectively validate it using a simple regular expression. So our browsers have taken care of that for us. So we can just put type equals email and not worry about having to enter in a regular expression there. But again, you'll find it for all kinds of things, and that's a good website to go to find those regular expressions. Now, if you don't find it on that site, you can simply do a search. For example, I did a search for social security regular, and you could type out regular expressions, or you could just type regex, which is the short for it. Enter that in, and you'll find plenty of examples of that. Now, hopefully you're not really going to be using Social Security regular expressions for your own website, but if you go to Google, type in what you're looking for along with the word regex, then you should be able to find something that will help you. So again, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Hello, and welcome back to HTML tips and tricks. Over the last several videos, we've gone over numerous unrelated intermediate level tips and tricks for working with HTML. Some of them were just fun little additions to our web pages, but some of them are really functional and helpful additions that we can make to our own HTML toolset in order to really improve our website, make it more useful, make our information more useful and more accessible, and to make our website more visible in a way that really helps our social media efforts, our search engine optimization efforts, etc. But hopefully you found some useful and fun little nuggets of information in this course. And if you have any ideas that you'd like to see covered in future tips and tricks videos, then please let us know. But once again, my name is Craig Campbell. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.